This is your brain. And this is heroin. This is what happens to your brain after snorting heroin. And this is what your body goes through. Wait, it's not over yet. This is what your family goes through. And your friends, and your money, and your drugs, and your self-respect, and your future. Any questions?
We want to be free. We want to be free to do what we want to do. And we want to get loaded.
Hi everyone, this is Michael P. and today I'm going to be sharing with you an article that is about the planning and initiation of the ONDCP's National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign. All of the articles that you see in this presentation will deal with this campaign, albeit in slightly different adaptations and iterations with some theoretical jargon thrown in for good measure. Before getting into the program specifics, here's a brief overview of the context for this campaign. Conceived in the mid-90s, this campaign was created in response to growing rates of substance abuse in America's youth at the time. An effort towards primary prevention, the National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign initially aimed to curb marijuana use and inhalant use in children aged 11 to 13 with the secondary audience of older teens and influential adults. The 5-year program received over $1 billion in government funding and is a great resource for examining both youth health campaigns and drug campaigns in general. Pre-planning for this program began in the mid-90s prior to the 1998 launch of the campaign. Designers established a program with a goal to educate and enable America's youth to reject illegal drugs. The goal includes preventing initiation of use by potential users and discouraging continuation of substance use by occasional users. Campaign management chose to focus on inhalant and marijuana use as these drugs are volatile and pervasive respectively. By early 1998, testing in 12 representative communities yielded feasible messages, and by mid to late 1998, these messages were distributed by community, corporate, and governmental partners through advertising, collaboration with entertainment, interactive communication, public information and news outreach, and corporate partnerships. The campaign itself is rooted in social cognitive theory, which the authors preferred for its focus on both the psychosocial dynamics underlying health behavior and the methods of promoting behavior change it offers. They favor the triadic and dynamic model of behavioral reciprocation to social, environmental, and personal factors. Social cognitive theory is, mostly, a theory for planning drug and youth health campaigns because it offers significant explanatory power for behavioral changes. It's sometimes referred to as social influence programs. Programs that utilize SCT are designed to inoculate youth against substance use through resistance skills like arguments before they encounter peer pressures. This simply means that messages sent to youth through SCT-based campaigns are intended to provide them with resources or tools to use in preventing, avoiding, or otherwise rejecting drug use. Organizers of this program referenced the Vermont School Mass Media Project as a successful SCT-based smoking intervention campaign. Results of that campaign show greater effect size for SCT curriculum that are implemented alongside established educational organizations. Therefore, this ONDCP campaign uses SCT to select a target audience of youth and their respective influential adults. In this case, that tended to be educational partnerships. Campaign planners decided to develop key decisions which inform the goals, objectives, channels, and materials to be used in this campaign. Here, they decided that the campaign's goal, more specifically, would be to educate and enable America's youth to reject illegal drugs, and it's centered on an aggressive paid advertising effort that will ensure that 90% of our target audience sees or hears an average of 4 anti-drug messages per week. Target audiences here are defined as adolescents in middle school ages, which would be 11 to 13 years old, because the transition years of elementary and middle school are peak years of first experimentation. They also define parental and caregiver and multicultural audiences as tertiary or secondary audiences for this messaging, as SCT really focuses on social environmental factors as being one of 3 major areas of influence on behavioral control. Campaign objectives were doubled as specific objectives were chosen for two distinctive audiences, which were youths and parents and other influential adults. The former group, youths, had messages that were focused more on personal efficacy, ideas of drug use, and an association of drug use with a negative lifestyle and avoidance of drug use with positive lifestyle. In contrast to that, parents and other influential adults were given messages that communicate zero tolerance policies, give perceptions of negative consequences of drug use, enhance perceptions of personal efficacy for adolescents, and enforce rules that encourage specific community-focused actions to facilitate prevention of adolescent drug use. The authors of this article also very clearly define their evaluation for the program after its completion. The program planned for evaluation through ad testing, media tracking studies, and a formal impact study, each of which provides some measure of information for campaign organizers, with ad testing specifically giving it a measure of advertising strength, so message efficacy, media tracking studies giving an idea of whether or not their goal for 90% of people to see 4 messages per day being accurate, and finally a formal impact study, which is what we're a little bit more used to, that was divided into 3 sub-foci. The impact study consisted of a national survey of parents and youth, a longitudinal community study, and a monitor of community activities. Each of these were chosen for addressing a particular ecological level of objective. So with the national survey of parents and youth, that was focused on the individuals who were impacted by messages. A longitudinal community study focuses more on how these messages impact community interaction. And a monitor of community activities actually gives a better measure of behavioral changes based on messaging from this campaign. The authors conclude that there's a great potential for synergy among the various activities within the National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign, and that will be very apparent in the next 2 articles that we talk about, where the influence of these campaigns can be seen through their adaptation. A suggestion is made that future prevention campaigns against substance abuse should draw on the ONDCP campaign experience, as other campaigns using social influence strategies might find it a useful blueprint, which we absolutely see happening nowadays, as this campaign had significant influence on future campaigns that address youth's drug use, addiction, and drug avoidance. Now, Michael Barnes is going to be sharing with you some information about how this campaign was adapted over the years to focus on more specific messaging that addresses further issues that arose around the subject.
So Sarah, what's going on here? Sarah? Sarah?
She won't answer you. Or she can't. This is the way it's been since she started smoking pot. She's all lazy and boring and... You know, we used to have so much fun together.
And now?
This is what we do.
Thank you, Michael. My article was focused on a specific campaign within the National Youth Anti-Drug Campaign that Mike P. was just talking about. So this article focuses on the marijuana initiative, which was a part of the national campaign from 2002 to 2003. And today I'm just going to go over the audience and how it's different from the original audience, the message and how it was different from the original message, and of course, highlight some of the outcomes of the study, some of the results. So let's dive right in. So in the 48 months prior to the marijuana initiative, they had gathered over 4,000 adolescents to participate in those studies. So for the marijuana initiative, or this study on the marijuana initiative, they honed in on 200 students that were high sensation seeking and wanted to change their behavior. And so they did this through self-reporting was a pretty important part of this, in my humble opinion, because anonymity is definitely to be taken into consideration when you're asking adolescents about their drug use. So their sample size ultimately yielded a 63.8% rate for eligible students. That 87% rate is also including refusals. And so measured all of these individuals, of course, by their demographics, such as age, gender, and ethnicity. A lot of person-focused things, such as whether or not they're sensation-seeking or their sensation-seeking score, their deviant behavior, their personal family attachment, but it also focused on some of those environmental factors, such as the perceived peer marijuana use or family marijuana use, and the risks, and also your family attachment and school attachment. Depending on where you are going to school, it might also determine your likelihood to use marijuana. And so, of course, they also measured for 30-day use of marijuana, alcohol, tobacco, inhalants, which was most common among adolescents, and whether or not they had used cocaine, amphetamines, ecstasy, or hallucinogens. So what was different about the Marijuana Initiative's message is that they definitely vamped up the fear appeals in this hard-hitting segment of their advertisements. With a lot of money, they also were able to more accurately target their demographic of high sensation-seeking adolescents. And so they produced 4 television shows, which aired in tandem with 4 radio advertisements, so that there was a bunch of exposure. Again, the Marijuana Initiative also focused on the consequences of using marijuana, unlike some of the messages preceding the Marijuana Initiative were criticized for being too lax and not to the point enough. So this particularly, what they used longitudinal analysis by collecting data from the past 48 months and delineating between high sensation seekers and low sensation seekers, and did it at an aggregate monthly data points. So they measured it in months. And here you see this graph is really informative how the campaign was working out starting in 1999 up until 2002. And then we have the implementation of the marijuana campaign. And we see a sharp decline in 30-day usage across all of these groups. Now, additionally, of course, the low sensation seekers weren't as affected by the ads because they weren't as targeted for them. However, there was significant downturn in marijuana use among high sensation seeking adolescents, and a significant downturn and the mediating variables, such as the positive attitudes and beliefs that come along with the marijuana use. Now, alcohol and tobacco are typically thought of as predecessors to marijuana use or used in addition to marijuana. Those uses of those substances were not affected as they predicted. Marijuana social norms were also, they also displayed linear upward development trends, which was somewhat significant. But in the most significance, they found that the exposure and sensationalism of their ads was what made the ad campaign so successful when in comparison to the 48 months preceding it. But also what became an issue was it just the frequent ad exposure that was leading to this, or the content of the advertisement? So especially with the self-reported data, it would be very difficult to discern that. However, using the rating scale and using rating scales and as independent variables, they're able to determine how marijuana use, 30-day mean marijuana use, is affected through those venues. So there wasn't any significance in exposure leading to change as much as there was the content of the ad. So I'm going to pause here and you can see one of the marijuana initiative ads. So clearly there's a very high sensation value of this kind of advertising. Advertising leading up to this was almost a joke. Some of them were funny. At least I think so. And as a youth, like being this exposed to such sensational advertising definitely elicited more sensory, emotional, and arousal responses. And it also produced the most sensational PSA of the entire national campaign, the 7th most, and also one that was just above average. But the effects were significant, and so of course what is to determine still is whether or not it was just the frequency of exposure. Additionally, would the marijuana initiative have been so successful without the previous failure of the National Youth Anti-Drug Campaign? Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it on to Dave, who's going to tell you about a more broad perspective of this specific drug campaign.
This is your brain. This is your brain watching the president talk about spending more money on anti-drug commercials.
Great commercials.
This is your brain reading a comprehensive government study about the failure of government-funded anti-drug commercials. This is your brain unable to fall asleep, distraught in the knowledge that the drug war has caused more harm, loss of lives, and destruction than the drugs themselves. This is your brain pouring a drink, noting the irony of past prohibitions and their failure. So here's the question. Why are we doing this again?
Hello, fellow communication campaigners. This is Dave here to provide you with some more background of health communication campaigns in the context of anti-drug messages. This article serves more as a guide to health communication scholars and campaign designers and provides many insightful tips that folks from all areas can benefit from. So, in this article, the authors present a general theory and overall model of communication campaigns' influence to demonstrate how communication campaigns can successfully produce effects as well as evaluate their progress. Furthermore, they suggest that a campaign must be driven by a theory of effects that can also guide evaluative processes. Using the National Anti-Drug Media Campaign as an exemplar, a campaign that at this point I'm sure you're all experts on, the authors illustrate how this campaign utilizes theory of effects and its implications to design all stages of evaluation. Finally, their most general point is to urge campaign designers from all areas to develop a theory of the campaign that acknowledges how behavior can really be affected and to evaluate the campaign consistently with that theory of effect. So this is the overall model of communication campaigns influence. And we can see it's a pretty simple model here, nothing Spitzbergy or anything like that. And there are 3 main routes that the message can be disseminated through. And it follows a process of changing behavior, right? That's the end goal. And so moving forward, the first thing that the author suggests through their general model of media campaign influence is that a particular campaign must reflect answers to each of the following questions. So starting with the first, what are the routes of effect? So going back, there are 3 paths that we looked at a second ago through which media campaigns may influence behavior. And these are the institutional, individual, and social levels. The author suggests that the most distinct route involves the direct exposure of individuals to campaign messages, whether through advertisements in the media or educational programs. I think we're all pretty fond of the DARE program from our childhood. So from this exposure, individuals may become cognizant of costs and benefits associated with certain behaviors, as well as form attitudes and beliefs about these behaviors. So they may learn the social norms associated with these behaviors and obtain skills to perform or avoid a certain behavior while also gaining the self-efficacy to do so. Now, this path of media effects is derived from theories of behavior change, such as the theory of reasoned action, the theory of planned behavior, aka TPB, the health belief model, and the social cognitive theory. Now, the first route mentioned is concerned with the diffusion of campaign themes to social institutions, such as the executive, legislative branches of government, the justice and law enforcement system, religious organizations, and the proverbial mass media. Now, once the themes have diffused to the institutions, their influence on individuals can appear in different forms. So some might increase their exposure to the campaign messages through their interaction with social institutions and organizations. For example, folks who were not directly exposed to a drug campaign may learn the risks of abusing through their interaction with a peer in their community, which would constitute secondary exposure. Now, the third general route involves campaign-induced processes of social diffusion. Via social interaction with family members, peers, and other members in the community, people may learn about practices that are socially approved and those that are not. The next big question they ask is, what is the expected lag between initiation of campaign exposure and effects? Now, some campaigns may expect immediate effects. However, this is not always a feasible task. If campaigns are reliant on a social or institutional model of message diffusion, then they can expect delayed responses. Hence, social and institutional diffusion takes longer than individual persuasion. The next question we ask is, what is the nature of expected outcomes? So some campaigns have well-focused objectives for behavior change. For example, to increase condom use at last vaginal intercourse by 25% among 18 to 35-year-olds who are having casual sex. With an expectation like that, the evaluator knows precisely what to measure. However, the objective of other campaigns may be satisfied by the acceptance of any of a set of behaviors. So for example, provided in the article was an example that a campaign aimed at lowering birth rates may find success regardless of which temporary or permanent contraceptive approach a couple chooses. So they don't have a necessarily well-focused objective, they find success in any amount of behavior change. Next, we ask how much exposure and how much time. So campaigns that utilize simple information diffusion may be able to depend on a few exposures to a message through a singular channel. Now, the theory of such campaign assumes that there is a ready audience out there for new information that solves an accepted problem. More typical campaigns, however, operate through multiple channels. So diffusion of messages repeatedly over time and supportive actions from institutions and social networks also constitute these typical campaigns. Each of these questions leads to specification of a theory of the campaign. The theory of the campaign directly lends insight to the methodological considerations. So evaluators need to determine the appropriate unit for expected effects. So that would be whether it's individual, social network, or community. And they also should specify the appropriate lag between exposure and effects and decide to focus on specific outcomes or generalized effects. Now we're going to look at this analysis of the National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign. By now, you should know most of the historical and contextual background behind the National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign. So to avoid stepping on toes and boring you, of course, I will go straight to discussing the analysis of the theory and take a look at another model that outlines the theory of the media campaign, which happens to be this model in front of us. So this model, which is named the Campaign Evaluation Model, illustrates routes through which the media campaign may influence youth drug behavior. Specifically, it is argued that any one youth may receive anti-drug messages from each of the following four sources. So exposure to media messages, interactions with friends or other peers, interaction with parents, and interaction with organizations. The likelihood of a youth's direct exposure to media anti-drug messages depends on two factors. First, how often the youth is exposed to that communication medium. For example, how often do they watch television? And second, the number and nature of advertisements that are placed in a given time period and on that medium. So this is usually measured as gross rating points, or GRPs. This model also considers that anti-drug messages may come from conversations with friends or peers. These conversations have been stimulated by the presence of the media campaign, whether by advertisements or activities carried out by other organizations. In any case, the campaign might have activated a social diffusion process that increased the number of drug-related messages heard by respondents. Unsurprisingly, anti-drug messages may come from parent-child conversations. One of the National Youth Anti-Drug Campaign's emphases has been to stimulate parents' involvement in their children's lives and, in particular, to encourage conversations about drugs and drug use. This assumes that if mass media campaigns are successful, more parent-child talks about drugs should exist, and thus a greater transmission of anti-drug messages from parents to children. Now, looking at the right side of the model, this is concerned with how exposure to anti-drug messages might be turned into behavior. This model basically relies on the theory of reasoned action and is also supported by Bandura's arguments concerning the importance of self-efficacy. This model assumes that intention to undertake an action is the primary determinant of whether that action will be undertaken. However, external forces such as the price and availability of the drugs may restrict or facilitate the transition from intention to action. Furthermore, the model assumes that intentions are largely a function of the following three influences: attitudes toward specific drug behaviors, perceptions of how important others expect one to act, and the belief that one has the skills to take an action, which is also known as self-efficacy. The youth's overall attitudes are influenced by the beliefs about the expected positive or negative consequences of those behaviors. Finally, this model assumes that exposure to anti-drug messages will influence those beliefs, perceived social expectations, skills, and self-efficacy. So, here are three major characteristics from many that were included in the evaluation design. So I'm kind of running into time here. So if you want, you can go ahead and pause it right now and take a look at these three components. When evaluating this campaign's progress, the authors suggest that it is first important to ask, were the youths and their parents substantially exposed to the campaign, and throughout what routes? Also, were they directly exposed to the campaign? And did that direct individual exposure affect their drug-related cognitions and behavior? To address these questions, the evaluation strategy has four elements. A, the basic measurement of the specific exposure of each youth. B, the covariation of individual specific exposures with outcomes. C, the possible role of confounders in accounting for any observed association as statistically controlled. And D, the concern that an observed association is addressed by testing whether prior exposure varies with lagged outcome. In summary, this article demonstrates how theory can be used to produce campaign effects, as well as suggests that the evaluation of a campaign must reflect the theory that is chosen during design. The authors argue that many campaigns' models of effect do not operate on the basic model that exposure leads to new cognitions, and that new cognitions will lead to behavior changes among individuals over a short term. They conclude that the way that campaigns may affect behavior is often nuanced, and if those nuances are not reflected in the evaluation design, then many of the effects may go unnoticed. Thank you everybody for chiming in, and we hope you learned a thing or two about theory and health comm campaigns specifically related to drug-related messages.